Welcome to an exploration of one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. Today, we venture into the deep shadows of the Ozark Mountains, where in 1895, an entire family disappeared without leaving a single clue. Before we start, share in the comments where you are joining from, and whether you are already familiar with this enduring mystery that remains officially unsolved. It was the late 19th century, a time when the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri still guarded secrets that the passage of years had failed to uncover. These ancient mountains, draped in thick forests and carved by deep valleys, had long been regarded as a place where the quiet held more power than spoken words. The people of that era knew every path, every creek, every curve in the dirt roads, snaking between old pines and oaks. Yet, there were corners where even the most courageous would not tread after sunset, when the rocky peaks swallowed the sun. In those days, Webster County, set in the very heart of the Ozarks, was a land of stark contrasts. Isolated homesteads were scattered across the mountain slopes, separated from one another by miles of impenetrable woodland. The families who chose to live there had to be tough, self-reliant, and ready to endure brutal winters that transformed roads into seas of impassable mud. Existence was difficult, but people found comfort in the small, close-knit community that revolved around rustic wooden churches and the occasional gathering at the lone general store within riding distance. One such family was the Bellamys. Thomas Bellamy was 38 when he settled in Webster County with his 33-year-old wife, Margaret, and their 4 children. The eldest, Joshua, was 15. Next came Sarah, 12, little Emma, just 8, and the youngest, Daniel, who was 5 when the family decided to make the Ozarks their new home. They had come from the east, from somewhere near the Mississippi River, searching for fertile land and the hope of a new beginning, far from the growing crowds of the cities. Thomas was known as a devout and industrious man. He built a solid log cabin with his own hands atop a wooded hill, roughly 15 miles from the nearest settlement, which was little more than a cluster of buildings around a Baptist church and a general store where farmers traded goods and news. The Bellamy land overlooked a deep valley where a creek flowed over mossy stones, and on clear days, the distant smoke from other farmhouse chimneys could be seen. Margaret managed the home and garden with quiet determination. Her nearest neighbors, the Crawford family, who lived almost 6 miles away, described Margaret as a gentle woman, reserved but always ready to offer help when it was needed. The children were well-behaved and assisted with the daily work. Joshua was already showing skill with tools, helping his father repair fences and care for their few animals. Sarah and Emma aided their mother with household tasks, while little Daniel played among the trees, exploring his surroundings with a child's wonder. The Bellamy family's first 2 years in the Ozarks passed without incident. They attended Sunday services when they could, and Thomas would occasionally travel down the mountain to buy supplies or sell some farm goods. The Crawfords later recalled that the family seemed content, part of the community, with no known disputes or enemies. It appeared the Bellamys had finally found a place to sink roots and raise their children in peace. Yet the calm of that mountainous region was about to be shattered in a way no one could have foreseen. The autumn of 1895 arrived, bringing an early chill and dense fogs that lingered well past midday. The trees began shedding their leaves, carpeting the forest floor in gold and red. It was a season of preparation for winter, of storing firewood, preserving food, and securing the homestead before the first snows. It was in mid-October of that year that something inexplicable occurred on the Bellamy farm, an event that would transform this forgotten Ozark corner into the scene of one of Missouri's most perplexing historical mysteries. And most disturbingly, to this day, over a century later, no one has uncovered definitive answers about what truly happened on that isolated hill where 5 people simply ceased to be. On the morning of October 23, 1895, Robert Crawford awoke with a peculiar sensation. He could not quite define it, but something in the cold morning air felt off. Perhaps it was the profound silence that filled the valley, or the fog, thicker than usual, that clung to his skin like a damp veil of disquiet. Robert had been the Bellamy's neighbor for 2 years and was familiar with the mountain's usual sounds: the far-off bark of a dog, the crack of an axe at dawn, the Sunday church bell. But that morning, everything was too still. 3 days had passed since Robert last saw Thomas Bellamy. This was not unusual. The vast distances in the Ozarks meant families could go weeks without meeting, especially when farm work consumed all time. Yet an unspoken rule existed among the area's settlers. They checked on one another, particularly as winter neared. It was a matter of survival. A broken leg, a sudden illness, any mishap could be fatal without aid. Robert decided to visit the Bellamys that afternoon. He saddled his horse after lunch and set off along the narrow trail connecting the 2 properties. The path twisted between tall trees, up sharp inclines, and down into valleys, where streams trickled over mossy stones. The ride took about an hour at a good pace. As he rode, Robert noticed crows acting restlessly, circling and crying over certain parts of the woods, their harsh calls cutting the heavy silence. When he finally reached the clearing where the Bellamy cabin stood, a knot formed in his stomach. Something was amiss. The first thing he saw was the front door, swinging slightly in the wind, wide open. Thomas would never leave the door open in such cold. The second alarming detail was the absolute quiet. No smoke rose from the chimney, no sounds of voices, children playing, or animals stirring. Only the wind in the trees and the creak of the door on its rusty hinges. Robert dismounted, tied his horse to a nearby tree, and called Thomas's name repeatedly. He received no answer. He walked slowly toward the cabin, his heart pounding, senses sharp. The open doorway revealed a dark interior. He paused before entering, as if an instinct warned him he was crossing a threshold from which there was no return. He took a breath and stepped inside. The cabin was in disarray, but not as one would expect from a robbery or fight. It was a strange clutter, as if the inhabitants had left in the middle of their routines and never came back. On the kitchen table were plates with food remnants already molding. An iron pot sat on the cold wood stove, containing what looked like stew, now spoiled. Chairs were pushed back from the table at odd angles, as if people had risen hastily. Robert walked through the rooms. In the main bedroom, the bed was unmade, blankets tossed aside. Clothes lay over a chair. In the children's room, wooden toys were scattered on the floor. A storybook lay open on a small table, as if a reading session had been interrupted. Everything pointed to a sudden halt to life, yet there were no signs of violence. No broken furniture, no struggle marks, no blood, or any indication of a confrontation. What unsettled Robert most was finding the family's coats hanging on pegs by the door. All 5 coats were there. Their boots were also lined up near the entrance. How could an entire family vanish in mid-October in the Ozarks without their coats or boots? Nighttime temperatures were already plunging. Survival in the woods would be impossible without proper protection, especially for young children. Robert left the cabin, his legs unsteady. He began searching the grounds, calling each family member's name. He checked the small barn where Thomas kept tools and hay. The family's mule and 3 chickens were there, seemingly unattended for days. The animals looked hungry and thirsty. Robert gave them food and water as he tried to make sense of the scene. He scanned the ground around the cabin for footprints or any clue to the family's direction. The earth was relatively dry for that season, making tracks hard to spot. He found a few marks near the front door, but nothing he could follow. The path to the main road showed no signs of recent travel. It was as if the Bellamys had evaporated into the air. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, stretching long shadows across the clearing, Robert made a decision. He needed help. He mounted his horse and rode back to his farm as fast as possible. At home, he told his wife what he had discovered. She grew pale hearing the account. That same evening, despite the approaching darkness, Robert rode to the nearest farm to spread the word. Something terrible had happened to the Bellamy family, and the whole community needed to know. News of the disappearance spread through the Ozarks like wildfire. Within 2 days, nearly everyone in Webster County knew an entire family had vanished without explanation. People spoke in hushed tones at the store, in church, during chance meetings on the roads. Some felt fear, others a morbid curiosity, but all shared a deep unease that something profoundly wrong had occurred in their mountains. The county sheriff, William Grant, was notified on October 25th. Grant was 52 and had been sheriff for nearly a decade. He was known for his careful and fair approach, though his resources were extremely limited. There was no organized police force, as in big cities, no advanced investigative tools. A sheriff's work in rural Missouri relied on local knowledge, witness accounts, and thorough legwork. Grant assembled a group of 12 men from the community and rode to the Bellamy property the next morning. The party included Robert Crawford as a guide, along with farmers, merchants, and even the local Baptist Reverend, Samuel Foster. All were resolved to find answers, yet apprehensive about what they might uncover. Tales of disappearances in the mountains were not rare, but they usually involved solitary travelers or individuals lost in the wilderness. An entire family vanishing from their own home was unheard of. When the group reached the Bellamy cabin, Sheriff Grant ordered everyone to wait outside, while he and 2 deputies conducted an initial inspection. Grant was meticulous. He examined each room slowly, taking notes in a worn notebook from his coat pocket. He noted the dishes on the table, the pot on the stove, the unmade bed, the scattered toys. Everything confirmed Robert Crawford's report. Life had been abruptly interrupted, but there were no signs of a struggle or violence. In the main bedroom, the sheriff spotted something of interest. On a small wooden dresser lay a family Bible, open to a specific page. Grant approached and saw a pencil mark beside a verse. He copied the passage into his notes, though unsure if it was relevant. He also found a small diary belonging to Margaret Bellamy. The last entries, from a week before the disappearance, described daily chores. Nothing hinted at trouble, threats, or unusual worry. After examining the cabin's interior, Grant organized a systematic search of the property. The 12 men split into groups and began combing the area in expanding circles, starting from the cabin. They looked for footprints, torn clothing, dropped items, or any evidence pointing to the family's fate. The surrounding forest was dense, full of deep ravines, hidden caves, and valleys where light barely reached. For 3 straight days, the search party worked from dawn to dusk. Other locals joined, widening the search beyond the Bellamy land. They scoured trails, creek banks, hidden clearings, and even some of the region's known caves. The Ozarks were famous for extensive cave systems, some explored, others unknown. The possibility that the family had entered a cave and gotten lost was considered, but it seemed unlikely given their coats and boots were left behind. On the 3rd day, one of the men found a shred of hope. About 2 miles from the cabin, on a little used southern trail, he discovered a scrap of fabric snagged on a thorn bush. The fabric was light blue, and several locals confirmed Margaret Bellamy owned a dress of that color. Sheriff Grant examined the cloth carefully. It appeared freshly torn, not weathered. This meant someone had passed through the area recently. The find energized the searchers. They concentrated their efforts in that direction, following the trail south. The path grew narrower and more difficult, winding through dense trees and down steep slopes. After about a mile, the trail ended abruptly at a cliff overlooking a deep valley. The sheriff and his men carefully examined the cliff edge for signs of a fall. They found nothing conclusive. In the following days, the search continued, but results grew increasingly discouraging. No bodies were found. No further evidence emerged. The piece of blue fabric remained the only tangible discovery, and even it could not be definitively proven to be Margaret's. Sheriff Grant broadened his investigation in other ways. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, asking if anyone had seen a family matching the Bellamy's description. He also questioned local merchants about recent transactions or unusual activity. One line of inquiry Grant pursued was the possibility the family had left voluntarily, perhaps fleeing debt, legal issues, or simply seeking a fresh start elsewhere. But this theory had obvious flaws. Why leave behind all their possessions, including clothes, tools, and the family Bible? Why depart without proper coats at the onset of winter? And above all, why did no one spot them on the road or in any nearby settlement? Reverend Foster, who knew the Bellamy family from Sunday services, was firm in his belief that Thomas would never abandon his property or endanger his family in such a manner. Thomas was a man of strong principles and hard work, deeply committed to his children. Margaret was a faithful and nurturing woman. The children were well-mannered and respectful. The notion that they would simply vanish of their own free will made no logical sense. There had to be another explanation, something that remained undiscovered. As October ended and November arrived, bringing the biting winter cold to the Ozarks, the official search effort gradually diminished. The men had to return to their own farms, tend to their families, and prepare for the harsh months ahead. Sheriff Grant kept the case active, but conceded that without fresh evidence or leads, his options were severely limited. The Bellamy cabin was secured and locked. The animals were taken in by neighbors, and the Ozark Mountains returned to their customary quiet, but now bearing a mystery that would linger for generations. The winter of 1895 struck the Ozarks with exceptional severity. Snow started falling in early November, covering the trails and transforming the landscape into a hushed, white expanse. Farms were cut off from each other, and mountain life narrowed to the essentials of survival, gathering firewood, rationing food, and enduring long, dark nights where families huddled by the fireplace, sharing stories to counter the cold and unease. Naturally, many of these stories centered on the Bellamy disappearance. As weeks passed, theories began to circulate among Webster County residents. Some were grounded in logic and observation. Others sprang from the fear and superstition that thrived in those remote hills. A prevalent theory was that the family had fallen victim to a crime. Perhaps thieves or bandits roaming the mountains had attacked the cabin, taken the family to a secluded spot, and committed terrible acts. Yet this theory faced a basic contradiction. There were no signs of forced entry, a struggle, or theft. Nothing of value was missing from the home. Others speculated the family might have discovered something in the woods, maybe gold or another hidden treasure, attracting dangerous attention. The Ozarks had a long-standing reputation for concealed riches dating back to indigenous tribes, and tales of buried treasure were common. However, there was no indication the Bellamys had made such a find or altered their behavior beforehand. A darker theory, mentioned only in whispers, suggested involvement with obscure rituals or encounters with cults rumored to exist in the mountain's most isolated parts. The late 19th century was a period of intense social change across America, and in rural areas, this sometimes manifested in extreme religious groups or secret societies. Still, there was absolutely no evidence linking the Bellamys to such circles. On the contrary, they were known as a conventional, devout Christian family. Sheriff Grant, despite lacking the means to sustain an active investigation through the winter, did not give up on the case entirely. He spent weeks reviewing his notes, speaking again with those who knew the family, searching for any overlooked detail. During this process, he learned something notable from a storekeeper operating about 40 miles from the Bellamy property. The merchant recalled that roughly 2 weeks before the disappearance, a strange man had passed through, asking about isolated farms and families living far from main roads. This detail greatly interested Grant. He sought more information about the mysterious individual. The merchant described him as average in appearance, aged between 30 and 40, with a dark beard and travel-worn clothing. He spoke with a non-local accent, possibly from the north. He had bought basic supplies and inquired about mountain routes. The merchant hadn't thought much of it at the time, as travelers were not unusual. But now, given the Bellamy's vanishing, those questions seemed suspicious. Grant sent descriptions of this man to authorities in neighboring counties, and even to larger cities like Springfield, some distance away. He asked them to watch for anyone matching the description, especially if seen with children. But weeks turned into months, with no relevant information. The mystery man, if connected to the case at all, had disappeared as utterly as the Bellamy family. When spring finally arrived in 1896, melting the snow and reopening the Ozark trails, Sheriff Grant organized a second search. This time the focus was on areas inaccessible during winter. Volunteer groups explored deeper caves, descended treacherous ravines, and scoured remote spots rarely visited. They found animal bones, remnants of old hunting camps, and even some rusted tools left by miners from decades past, but no trace of the Bellamys. During this spring search, a group exploring an area roughly 5 miles north of the cabin found something unusual. In a small clearing hidden at the bottom of a valley, they discovered signs of a campfire that appeared to have been used months earlier. Ground markings around the fire suggested several people had camped there. They also found fragments of burnt cloth in the ashes, though they were too deteriorated to determine origin or original color. What made the campsite intriguing was its location, entirely off any known path, in a place only reachable by someone with excellent knowledge of the mountains or someone deliberately hiding. Sheriff Grant theorized the Bellamys might have been led there by someone, but without more concrete evidence, a connection couldn't be proven. The clearing was documented, but it yielded no further secrets to advance the investigation. As 1896 progressed, the Bellamy case grew cold, not from forgetfulness, but from a sheer lack of new leads. Sheriff Grant continued to receive occasional reports of sightings of people resembling family members in various parts of Missouri and even in neighboring states like Arkansas and Kansas. Each report was checked, but none were verified. They were cases of mistaken identity, vague resemblances, or sometimes fabricated stories from attention seekers. The Bellamy cabin stood abandoned. No one wished to live there, both out of respect for the missing family and due to a growing superstition that the place was marked by a dark presence. Windows were boarded, the door chained shut. Nature slowly reclaimed the site. Vines climbed the wooden walls, the roof began to sag, and wild vegetation overran the clearing. The property became a silent monument to an inexplicable mystery. Nearby neighbors, like the Crawford family, reported odd experiences when passing the former Bellamy land. Some mentioned hearing faint voices at dusk when no one was around. Others spoke of unexplained lights seen through the trees at night. Reverend Foster, always skeptical of superstitions, attributed these accounts to active imaginations and the natural fear associated with the place. Yet even he admitted there was something profoundly unsettling about the entire situation, something that evaded rational understanding. The years following the Bellamy disappearance brought significant changes to Webster County and the Ozarks overall. The 19th century was closing, bringing improved roads, more settlers, and a slow but inevitable modernization, reaching even Missouri's remotest corners. Yet the Bellamy mystery remained an open wound in the region's collective memory, a reminder that some questions simply have no answers, no matter how diligently we search. In 1898, 3 years after the disappearance, a new development rekindled interest in the case. A farmer named Albert Monroe, living about 30 miles from the former Bellamy homestead, approached Sheriff Grant with a troubling story. Monroe said that, while organizing his barn, he found a small rag doll hidden among old hay bales. The doll was dirty and worn, but what caught his eye was an embroidered design on the back of its dress, the letter E. Monroe had no idea how the doll ended up in his barn. He questioned his wife and 3 children, but none knew anything about it. It didn't belong to any of his children, and Monroe swore he'd never seen it before. When Robert Crawford's wife, who had visited the Bellamy cabin before the disappearance, heard about the doll, she turned pale. She distinctly remembered seeing 8-year-old Emma Bellamy carrying a very similar doll, which Emma adored and rarely let out of her sight. Sheriff Grant examined the doll carefully. If it truly was Emma's, it raised alarming questions. How had it ended up in Albert Monroe's barn, so far from the Bellamy cabin? Monroe insisted he had no connection to the missing family, having seen Thomas Bellamy only once or twice in town. Grant investigated the possibility that someone had planted the doll to misdirect the investigation, but found no evidence to support this. The doll's discovery sparked a new wave of speculation. Some saw it as proof the family had passed near Monroe's property during or after their disappearance. Others interpreted it as evidence that someone had intercepted the Bellamys and scattered their belongings. Sheriff Grant organized a search around Monroe's farm, but found nothing beyond the mysterious doll another puzzle piece that didn't fit. That same year, reports about the case began appearing in local newspapers. The Bellamy disappearance was already well known regionally, but now it attracted wider attention. Newspapers in larger cities like Springfield and even St. Louis published speculative articles about the Ozark mystery. Some were sensational, exaggerating details and inventing fanciful theories without basis. This frustrated Sheriff Grant, who struggled to maintain a serious investigation amid the noise. One newspaper article caught the attention of a Kansas City private detective named Harrison Webb. Webb had a reputation for solving difficult cases and was intrigued by the Bellamy mystery. He traveled to Webster County in 1899, 4 years after the disappearance, offering his services free of charge. Webb was a methodical man trained in investigative techniques, still relatively new at the time. He believed crimes always leave traces, no matter how careful the perpetrator. For 3 months, Harrison Webb conducted his own investigation. He re-examined the Bellamy cabin, now in an advanced state of decay. He spoke with everyone in the area with any connection, however distant to the family. He reviewed Sheriff Grant's files and traveled to neighboring counties seeking overlooked information. Webb was particularly interested in creating detailed profiles of each family member, believing understanding who they were might explain what happened. What Webb discovered was a completely ordinary family. Thomas Bellamy had no known enemies, owed no debts, and was not involved in any illegal or controversial activities. Margaret was universally described as kind and reserved. The children appeared healthy and happy. There was no apparent reason anyone would want to harm them, nor any reason they would voluntarily disappear, abandoning all they owned. Webb also delved deeply into the theory of the mysterious man inquiring about isolated farms weeks before the disappearance. He traveled to the store where the man was seen and spoke extensively with the merchant. He gathered additional details about the man's appearance and attempted to track him through local hotel and boarding house records. But the trail was 4 years cold. If this man was connected to the Bellamy's disappearance, he had vanished as completely as his potential victims. After 3 months of intense work, Harrison Webb reached a frustrating conclusion. The Bellamy case was one of the most baffling mysteries he had ever encountered. He found no conclusive evidence to support any specific theory. In his final report to Sheriff Grant, Webb wrote that he believed the family had been victims of a carefully planned crime, executed by someone who knew the mountains well and covered their tracks. But with no bodies, no witnesses, and no substantial physical evidence, proving this theory or identifying a suspect was impossible. Webb's report included a disturbing observation. He noted that in the years preceding the Bellamy disappearance, there had been a series of other unexplained disappearances in various parts of the Ozark Mountains. These were isolated cases, usually involving lone travelers or small families in remote areas. Most were attributed to accidents, people lost in the woods dying from exposure, or individuals moving on without notice. But Webb wondered if a connection might exist between these cases. This suggestion caused considerable unease in the region. The idea that someone or some group might be operating in the Ozarks, making people disappear over years, was terrifying. Sheriff Grant investigated the cases Webb mentioned, but could establish no clear link. The circumstances of each disappearance differed. Locations were spread across a vast area with no discernible pattern. They might simply have been tragic coincidences in a vast, dangerous region where life was always difficult and uncertain. Still, Webb's suggestion left its mark. Ozark residents began exercising more caution, keeping families closer and avoiding solitary travel on remote trails. The Bellamy cabin became not just a reminder of an unsolved mystery, but a symbol of unknown dangers lurking in the mountain shadows. And as the new century approached, that crumbling wooden structure atop a lonely hill stood as a silent witness to events that might never be fully understood. The 20th century arrived, bringing transformations no one in the Ozark Mountains could have imagined a decade earlier. Telegraph lines expanded across the region, connecting isolated communities to the rest of the country. Railroads began carving through valleys that were once reachable only on horseback. Electricity, still a distant novelty for most rural dwellers, was talked about as the inevitable future. Yet amidst all this progress, the Bellamy family mystery remained frozen in time, as impenetrable as ever. In 1903, 8 years after the disappearance, Sheriff William Grant retired. He was now 60 years old, and in poor health after decades of demanding work. On his final day in office, Grant admitted in a local newspaper interview that the Bellamy case was his greatest professional regret. Not from a lack of effort, he clarified, but from the frustration of never being able to provide the involved families and the wider community with the answers they deserved. He passed the case to his successor, a younger man named Thomas Bridger, handing over 3 boxes of documents, notes, and evidence collected over the years. Bridger was efficient and dedicated, but he recognized the limitations before him. The trail had been cold for nearly a decade. Those who might have held relevant information were aging. Some had already died. The Bellamy cabin itself was almost completely ruined, swallowed by vegetation and natural decay. Bridger reviewed all the material left by Grant, but arrived at the same frustrating conclusion. Without new evidence, the investigation could not advance. The case remained officially open, but was, in practice, dormant. Yet the mystery lived on in the popular imagination. Stories about the Bellamys were told and retold around fireplaces, at community gatherings, and in churches. Each retelling added new layers, some based on fact, others on pure speculation. Urban legends arose, transforming the abandoned cabin into a haunted place where the family's spirits were said to still wander, trapped between worlds. Young people dared each other to spend a night in the ruined structure, though few actually possessed the courage. In 1907, 12 years after the disappearance, an incident occurred that briefly rekindled public interest. A group of federal geologists mapping cave systems in the Ozarks discovered a vast, previously unknown underground network about 15 miles from the former Bellamy property. The caves extended for miles beneath the surface, featuring deep chambers, subterranean rivers, and labyrinthine passages that could easily disorient anyone without proper equipment. This discovery led to a new theory. Perhaps the Bellamy family had somehow entered one of these unknown caves and become lost in the underground system. This would explain their complete disappearance without a surface trace. Sheriff Bridger organized expeditions to explore these newly discovered caves with the geologists' help. They spent weeks scouring the dark depths, shining their lights into every crevice, searching for any sign of human presence. What they found was both fascinating and terrifying. The caves contained spectacular rock formations, crystal-clear underground rivers, and cathedral-sized chambers. But they also found evidence of past human activity, ancient markings on walls, the remains of fires extinguished decades earlier, and in one of the deepest chambers, human bones that appeared centuries old. Geologists speculated the bones might belong to Native Americans who used the caves for rituals or shelter long before European settlers arrived. However, they found no trace of the Bellamy family. No clothing, personal items, or any indication of recent entry. While plausible in principle, the cave theory didn't hold up due to the lack of evidence. The fundamental questions remained. How could the entire family have reached those caves without coats or boots, especially the young children? And why would they have left their cabin in the middle of a meal for such a journey? During those early 20th century years, several people claimed to have seen members of the Bellamy family in various locations. A merchant in Arkansas swore he saw a woman who looked exactly like Margaret Bellamy in 1909. She was with 2 children and appeared nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. When the merchant tried to approach, the woman grabbed the children and quickly vanished into a crowd at a local market. Sheriff Bridger investigated, but could not confirm her identity. Another sighting occurred in 1911 when a Kansas farmer reported hiring a temporary worker for his property. The man, who introduced himself as John Smith, was roughly the age Joshua Bellamy would have been. 31. The farmer noticed the man had a distinctive scar on his left hand, and Joshua's mother had once mentioned to Reverend Foster that her son had a scar in that exact spot from a childhood tool accident. Sheriff Bridger traveled to Kansas to investigate personally, but upon arrival, the man was already gone. The farmer said John Smith had worked only 2 weeks before moving on, leaving no forwarding address. He described him as competent, but extremely reserved, avoiding discussions of his past and always seeming alert, as if expecting danger. Bridger attempted to track the man through neighboring towns, but was unsuccessful. These sightings, and others like them over the years, raised more questions than answers. If they truly were the Bellamys, why were they living under false names? What were they fleeing? And if they weren't the Bellamys, why did so many reports describe individuals matching their descriptions so accurately? Each new report brought a flicker of hope, followed by inevitable disappointment when investigations led nowhere. As years passed, it became increasingly unlikely the mystery would ever be solved. People directly connected to the case were dying. Robert Crawford, the neighbor who discovered the abandoned cabin, passed away in 1913. Reverend Foster died 2 years later. Even some original search team members were gone. With each death, a piece of the case's living memory disappeared, leaving only documents, notes, and stories growing ever more distant from the original events. The Bellamy cabin finally collapsed completely around 1915, 20 years after the disappearance. A particularly violent summer storm leveled what remained of the structure. When Sheriff Bridger visited the site weeks later, he found only piles of rotting wood, moss-covered foundation stones, and nature aggressively reclaiming the space. It was as if the mountains were trying to erase even the physical memory of the family that once lived there. The years following World War I brought profound changes to the United States and the Ozarks. Young men who had fought overseas returned with stories of horror and loss that made the Bellamy mystery seem a distant echo from another time. The 1920s arrived, bringing the Jazz Age, urban economic prosperity, and rapid modernization that finally reached Missouri's remotest corners. Automobile roads began replacing old wagon trails, and the world seemed smaller, more connected. But amidst all this transformation, some still could not forget. In 1923, 28 years after the disappearance, a woman named Elizabeth Crawford contacted the Webster County Sheriff's Office. Elizabeth was the daughter of Robert Crawford, the man who had discovered the Bellamy's abandoned cabin so long ago. She was only 7 years old when it happened, but the memories never left her. Now 40, married with her own children, Elizabeth felt compelled to share something she had kept hidden for decades. She told the current sheriff, Daniel Morrison, who had taken office just 2 years earlier, that her father had carried a secret in his final years. On his deathbed in 1913, Robert Crawford confessed to his daughter that he hadn't told everything he knew about the day he found the empty cabin. Elizabeth explained her father was tormented by this omission and, with death approaching, felt the need to ease his conscience. What he revealed was disturbing. Robert Crawford had found a small notebook hidden under the bed in the children's room, belonging to 12-year-old Sarah Bellamy. The notebook contained childish drawings and short notes typical for her age. But on the last pages, apparently written in the days before the disappearance, were sentences that deeply unsettled Robert. Sarah wrote about a man who would sometimes appear in the woods, always keeping his distance, watching the family. She described how frightening he was, how something was wrong with his eyes, and how she begged her parents to do something, but they dismissed him as just a passing hunter. Robert Crawford, upon finding this notebook, panicked. He feared revealing its existence might somehow implicate him in the disappearance. After all, he was the closest neighbor, the one who discovered the scene. In the early days of any investigation, suspicion often falls on the person who finds evidence. In a moment of weakness and fear, he hid the notebook inside his coat and never mentioned it to Sheriff Grant. For years, that secret gnawed at him, but the fear of being misunderstood overpowered his will to do the right thing. Only at life's end did he find the courage to tell his daughter. Elizabeth explained to Sheriff Morrison that she had kept the secret out of respect for her father and uncertainty about what to do with the information. But now, with her own children growing up, she felt the Bellamy family deserved the full truth to be known, even if it came too late. She had kept the notebook all these years and brought it with her to show the sheriff. Morrison examined the notebook with trembling hands. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words remained legible. Sure enough, in the final entries, there were those unsettling observations about a mysterious man in the woods. This revelation shed new light on the case, though it came far too late for an effective investigation. The man the storekeeper had mentioned, the one asking about isolated farms, could very well be the same man Sarah Bellamy described. He had been watching the family, studying their movements, waiting for the right moment. But for what? And who was he? Morrison knew finding answers nearly 3 decades later would be virtually impossible. Still, he felt he had to try. Sheriff Morrison officially reopened the Bellamy case. He reviewed all the old files, read every report and note left by his predecessors. He published articles in newspapers across Missouri and neighboring states, asking anyone with relevant information, no matter how old, to contact him. The response was astonishing. Dozens of letters arrived at his office in the following weeks. Some were from well-meaning individuals offering theories or recalling details they thought might be relevant. Others were clearly from disturbed people confessing to crimes they didn't commit, or reporting visions and dreams with no basis in reality. Among these letters, one in particular caught Morrison's attention. It was from an elderly man named Samuel Hartwell, living in a Little Rock, Arkansas nursing home. Hartwell wrote that in the fall of 1895, he was a young laborer traveling through the Ozarks, doing odd jobs on farms. He was 23 at the time. Hartwell reported that in mid-October of that year, he camped for a night near a mountain trail and heard strange sounds from the nearby woods in the early morning. The sounds, as Hartwell described, seemed to be several people moving through the woods, but strangely, as if being led against their will. He heard what sounded like muffled voices, as if someone was trying to scream but was being prevented. Hartwell, young and frightened, hid in his camp, not daring to investigate. At daybreak, he quickly moved on, wanting to get away from the area as fast as possible. For years, he convinced himself he had imagined it all, that it was just the wind or nocturnal animals. But when he read about the Bellamy case and the date of their disappearance, he realized he might have witnessed something terrible. Morrison traveled to Little Rock to interview Hartwell in person. The man was now 81, frail but clear-headed. He repeated his story with consistent detail and pointed out on an old map approximately where he had camped that night. Morrison estimated the location to be about 8 miles from the Bellamy cabin, in a direction leading into even more remote mountain areas. It was plausible that if the family had been abducted, the perpetrator could have taken them along that route. Armed with this new information, Morrison organized a final major search of the area Hartwell indicated. It was now the summer of 1924. Volunteers from the community, some of them children and grandchildren of those who had participated in the original searches decades earlier, joined the effort. They scoured every valley, ravine, and accessible cave in the region. They looked for unmarked graves, buried objects, any trace of human presence hidden beneath decades of plant growth and natural decay. During 5 intense days of searching, the group found several interesting but inconclusive items. Remains of old camps with evidence of repeated use over years, discarded objects from different eras, rusted tools, broken glass bottles. In one particularly deep cave, they found what appeared to be inscriptions carved into walls, but they were too worn to read clearly. None of this provided a definitive connection to the Bellamy family. On the final day, when most volunteers were ready to give up, a young man named Thomas Miller made a discovery that gave everyone pause. In a small, hidden ravine, partially covered by dense vegetation, he found fragments of what appeared to be human bones. Morrison and the others rushed to the site. The bones were scattered, partially buried under leaves, and dirt accumulated over decades. Wild animals had clearly disturbed the site over the years. It was impossible to say how many individuals were represented, or how long the remains had been there. Morrison carefully collected every bone fragment he could find, and sent them for analysis to a university in St. Louis, where anatomy and medical professors could examine them. The wait for results was agonizing. For weeks, Morrison and the entire Webster County community wondered if they would finally have answers, if these bones belonged to the Bellamy family, if the mystery that had haunted the region for nearly 3 decades was about to be solved. The bone analysis results arrived in September 1924, bringing a mix of revelations and frustrations that seemed to define the entire Bellamy case. Professors at the University of St. Louis concluded that the bone fragments found in the ravine belonged to at least 3 different individuals. Based on size and development, experts determined that 2 were adults and 1 was a child, likely between 8 and 12 years old. The bones had been there for decades, likely between 20 and 30 years, perfectly aligning with the timeline of the Bellamy disappearance. However, a critical obstacle prevented a definitive identification. Forensic science in the early 1920s lacked the sophisticated tools that would emerge later. There was no method to extract genetic information from the remains. No detailed dental records existed for the Bellamy family for comparison, and the fragments were in poor condition due to prolonged exposure to the elements and wildlife. The professors could confirm the bones were human and from approximately the correct period, but they couldn't state with absolute certainty they belonged to the Bellamys. They might have belonged to anyone who died in those mountains during that era. Sheriff Morrison was deeply frustrated, though not surprised. Even so, the discovery represented the most significant find in nearly 3 decades of investigation. He decided to proceed on the assumption the bones likely belonged to members of the Bellamy family, while acknowledging conclusive proof would never be possible. Morrison arranged a proper funeral, and the remains were interred in the local Baptist churchyard. A simple headstone was erected, bearing the names of all 5 Bellamy family members and their known birth dates, followed simply by 1895 as the year of presumed death. The funeral took place on a gray October afternoon, exactly 29 years after the disappearance. Over 200 people attended, arriving from across Webster County and neighboring areas. Among them were the few surviving individuals who had known the family personally, now very elderly, children and grandchildren of those who had participated in the original searches, curious onlookers who had grown up hearing the stories, and journalists from several newspapers documenting this moment of partial closure to one of Missouri's most enigmatic cases. The reverend leading the service, a young man not even born when the Bellamys vanished, spoke of the fragility of life on the 19th century American frontier. He spoke of how many stories were lost, how many lives were lived and ended without proper record, especially in remote regions where law and order were distant, fragile concepts. He urged those present to remember not just the mystery, but the real lives that were lived, the hopes and dreams Thomas and Margaret Bellamy held for their children, the courage it took to build a life in those challenging mountains. Elizabeth Crawford, now 41, placed flowers on the headstone and wept silently. She carried the weight of knowing her father had withheld crucial information out of fear information that might have altered the initial investigation's course. While rationally she understood her father acted from panic, not malice, and that it likely wouldn't have changed the final outcome, a feeling of guilt by association haunted her. She whispered a plea for forgiveness to the headstone, hoping that wherever they were, the Bellamys could find peace. In the days and weeks following the funeral, intense debate unfolded in the community and newspapers about what had truly happened. The discovery of the bones in the ravine, combined with Samuel Hartwell's account of strange sounds and Sarah Bellamy's notes about the mysterious watcher in the woods, formed a plausible, if incomplete, scenario. The most widely accepted theory was that the family had been abducted by one or more criminals operating in the Ozarks, taken to that remote location, and killed for reasons that remained unclear. Yet this theory, as logical as it seemed, left fundamental questions unanswered. What motive could exist for killing an entire family? The Bellamys weren't wealthy. They owned nothing of great value to justify such a crime. If robbery was the motive, why was nothing taken from the cabin? If a personal vendetta was involved, who held such a grudge against this peaceful, religious family? And even more intriguingly, where was the 5th body? University experts had confirmed remains from only 3 individuals in the ravine. If those were indeed Bellamys, what happened to the other 2? Some speculated that perhaps Joshua, the 15-year-old eldest son, and little 5-year-old Daniel, had met different fates. Perhaps Joshua had managed to escape during the attack and was living somewhere under another name, tormented by traumatic memories and unable to return. Or perhaps little Daniel had been taken for other reasons no one wished to articulate aloud. There were dark stories, especially from that era, about children being kidnapped for forced labor, or worse. These possibilities were so disturbing, many preferred not to contemplate them. Sheriff Morrison continued investigating, even after the funeral. But in the eyes of most, the case was essentially closed. He maintained correspondence with Samuel Hartwell until the old man's death 2 years later, hoping some additional memory might surface. But nothing new emerged. Morrison also tried to track down the various reports of family member sightings over the years, but all trails were too cold. If Joshua Bellamy or any other family member had survived and was living under a false identity, they had hidden themselves too well to be found. In 1927, Sheriff Morrison published a final report on the case. The 43-page document detailed the entire story of the disappearance, from the initial discovery of the abandoned cabin to the recent funeral. Morrison included interview transcripts, copies of relevant documents, maps showing search and discovery locations, and his own analysis of what likely transpired. The report ended on a somber note. While he believed the Bellamy family had been victims of violent crime and that their remains had been found and buried with dignity, he acknowledged the exact circumstances of their deaths and the identity of those responsible would likely never be known. Morrison's report was filed in Webster County records and eventually sent to the state archives in Jefferson City, Missouri's capital. There, alongside thousands of other documents concerning unsolved crimes, mysterious disappearances, and forgotten tragedies in American history, the Bellamy case remained on dusty shelves. Occasionally, a researcher or historian interested in Missouri's historical crimes would discover the report and become fascinated by the mystery, but no significant new information ever emerged. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, dramatically transforming life across the United States, including the Ozarks. People's concerns shifted to immediate survival, finding work, feeding families, and holding on to property during devastating economic times. The Bellamy mystery, while not forgotten, became a relic of another era, a dark story from the past that seemed less urgent in the face of present hardships. Still, there were moments when the case resurfaced in public consciousness. In 1935, exactly 40 years after the disappearance, a Springfield newspaper published a lengthy commemorative article recounting the entire story, including photographs of the gravestone and speculating about what might have happened. Readers sent letters to the editor with their own theories, some well-considered, others clearly fanciful. One elderly woman wrote that her grandfather, deceased for years, had once mentioned knowing a suspicious man who lived as a hermit deep in the Ozarks during that time, but she lacked enough detail to make the information useful. What became clear as decades passed was that the Bellamy case had evolved into something larger than the specific facts of their disappearance. It became part of Ozark mythology, a story encapsulating the dangers and mysteries of that region during its wildest days. It served as a reminder of a time when life was harsher, justice more distant, and secrets could be kept hidden in the mountains for generations. Perhaps some thought it was for the best. Perhaps some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, allowing each generation to find its own lessons and meaning in history. The years of World War II again brought a period of profound change to the United States. Millions of young men left to fight overseas, and those who remained worked tirelessly to support the war effort. The Ozark Mountains, like the rest of the country, were transformed by this massive mobilization. Roads were improved for military transport, communications expanded, and the rural world that had existed for generations began to disappear definitively. When soldiers returned after 1945, many no longer desired the isolated life their grandparents had known. They sought cities, factory jobs, and the promises of modernity. Yet even amidst all these transformations, the Bellamy mystery remained an indelible mark on the region's collective memory. In 1950, 55 years after the disappearance, a University of Missouri historian named Margaret Thornton decided to conduct comprehensive academic research on unsolved 19th century crimes in the state. The Bellamy case naturally captured her attention, not only due to the mysterious nature of the disappearance, but also because of the exceptional volume of documentation that had survived over the decades. Thornton spent 2 years investigating the case. She traveled throughout Webster County, interviewing the few elderly survivors who had any connection, however distant, to the original events. She meticulously examined newspaper archives, church documents, property records, and every official report available. The result was a 230-page master's thesis, representing the most comprehensive and scholarly analysis of the case to date. Thornton's thesis did not solve the mystery, but it provided invaluable historical context and a careful evaluation of the various theories that had emerged over the decades. One of her most significant contributions was situating the Bellamy disappearance within the broader context of violence on the late 19th century American frontier. She documented dozens of similar cases across the country during that period. Entire families vanishing under mysterious circumstances, most never resolved. Thornton argued that the romanticized image of the Old West often obscured a brutal reality, where life was tragically fragile and justice frequently failed to reach the most remote areas. Her thesis also explored the psychology behind the enduring fascination with the case. Thornton suggested that unsolved mysteries like the Bellamys touched something deep in the human psyche: our discomfort with uncertainty, our need to find patterns and meaning even where none may exist. The case continued to attract attention, not only for the mystery itself, but for what it represented about the human condition, how we confront the unknown and construct narratives to make sense of chaos. During the 1960s, a new generation discovered the Bellamy case through a different medium. Popular mystery and true crime magazines began featuring it, sometimes with dramatic illustrations of the fog-shrouded abandoned cabin or artistic recreations of that fateful October night. These publications often exaggerated details or added sensational elements without factual basis, yet they kept the story alive in the public imagination. In 1975, a Missouri independent filmmaker named Robert Chen decided to create a documentary about the case. Known for his regional history films, Chen was captivated by the complexity and longevity of the Bellamy mystery. He spent months researching, filming at the location where the cabin once stood, now fully reclaimed by the forest, and interviewing historians, including the retired Professor Margaret Thornton, who remained engaged with the case. Chen's documentary, titled Shadows of the Ozarks, was screened at several universities and regional film festivals. While it never achieved widespread commercial distribution, it was well received by audiences. Chen avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on the human dimension of the tragedy and the lasting impact the mystery had on Webster County. The film included footage of the weathered headstone, by then over 40 years old, and concluded with a quiet meditation on the limits of knowledge and the stories lost to time. One viewer of Chen's documentary at a university screening was a young amateur genealogist named David Pritchard. Intrigued, he launched his own investigation, focusing on an angle previously unexplored, tracing possible descendants of the Bellamy family or distant relatives who might still be alive. This meticulous task involved delving into census records, immigration documents, and birth and death certificates scattered across multiple states. Pritchard discovered that Thomas Bellamy had a younger brother named William, who had remained east near the Mississippi River. When Thomas moved to the Ozarks, William never learned the full truth about his brother's fate, as communications were slow and unreliable. By the time he received vague news of the disappearance, years had passed. William died in 1918, but he left descendants who lived unaware of the tragedy that had befallen part of their family decades earlier. Pritchard managed to locate William Bellamy's great-grandchildren living across the country. When contacted, most were shocked. They had no idea their family tree contained such a dark chapter. Some expressed interest in learning more, while others preferred not to engage with the disturbing story. Pritchard compiled his findings in an article published in a genealogy journal in 1978, providing for the first time a complete Bellamy family tree and showing how collateral descendants were dispersed nationwide. During the 1980s, advances in forensic science sparked new hope that long-standing mysteries might finally be solved through technology. Genetic testing was becoming more sophisticated, capable of extracting information from ancient biological samples previously considered useless. In 1985, 90 years after the disappearance, a group of forensic scientists at a Tennessee university proposed re-examining the bone fragments buried in 1924. The proposal ignited heated debate in Webster County. Some felt it disrespectful to disturb the remains again after they had received a proper burial decades earlier. Others argued that the pursuit of truth justified examination, even if it was extremely unlikely anyone responsible could still be held accountable. After months of discussion involving local officials, community leaders, and some of the Bellamy family's distant descendants, the decision was made not to exhume the remains. Practical considerations drove this choice. The bone fragments were in very poor condition when first found, and after over 60 years in the ground, they would likely be even more degraded. Furthermore, even if usable genetic material could be extracted, there were no suitable comparison samples. The living descendants were too distantly related, and the science of the time was not advanced enough to make reliable genetic matches across so many generations. The community ultimately decided to let the dead rest in peace. This decision marked, in a sense, the definitive closure of the Bellamy case as an active investigation. While historical and academic interest persisted, the possibility of solving the mystery through modern forensic means had passed. The case would forever remain an incomplete story, its gaps unable to be filled by any amount of research or technology. Perhaps there was a peaceful acceptance in this, an acknowledgement that not all stories have clear endings, and that part of the human experience is living with unanswered questions. In the final years of the 20th century, the Bellamy mystery found a new audience through the emerging internet. Unsolved crime enthusiasts created dedicated websites, forums for discussing theories, and even podcasts exploring every angle of the story. A new generation, digitally connected, but perhaps lacking a tangible link to the past, found in the Bellamy mystery a tale that resonated across time, reminding them that even in an age of instant information, some secrets remain veiled. The turn of the millennium brought natural reflection on the past and future. The year 2000 marked not only a new technological era, but also 105 years since the Bellamy family's disappearance. For those familiar with the story, it was a stunning reminder of how much time had passed, how many generations had lived and died since that October night in 1895. The mystery had become truly historical, removed from living memory for over a century, transformed into something belonging entirely to books, archives, and regional folklore. In Webster County, few physical traces of the tragedy remained. The headstone in the Baptist churchyard still stood, though severely weathered, its inscription nearly illegible after 75 years of rain, snow, wind, and sun. The site where the Bellamy cabin once stood had been completely absorbed by the forest. Anyone walking there would have no way of knowing a house had ever existed, that a family had tried to build a life there, that dreams had been abruptly severed. Nature had reclaimed everything, erasing even the stone foundations. In 2005, 110 years after the disappearance, the Missouri Historical Society installed a commemorative plaque at the approximate location of the Bellamy homestead. It was a modest but significant project. The bronze plaque, mounted on a stone base near the believed site of the cabin, bore a simple, factual text. It stated that the Bellamy family had lived there, that they disappeared under mysterious circumstances in October 1895, and that the case was never solved. There was no speculation, no dramatic theories, just a solemn acknowledgement that those lives existed and deserved remembrance. The plaque's unveiling ceremony was small, but moving. About 50 people attended, including local historians, historical society members, some distant Bellamy descendants located decades earlier, and residents who felt a connection to the story. One of William Bellamy's great-grandsons, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Bellamy, Jr., named after the great-grandfather he never knew, gave a brief speech. He spoke of the importance of remembering, even when answers elude us, of honoring those who came before, and whose experiences, however tragic, are part of our collective fabric. In the following years, the plaque became an occasional destination for history enthusiasts and mystery seekers. People hiked the trail to the site, photographed the plaque, and lingered in silent reflection. Some left flowers at the stone base. Others wrote in visitor logs kept by the Historical Society. Comments ranged from musings on life's fragility to elaborate theories about what might have happened, each visitor bringing their own perspective to this place steeped in history and mystery. The digital age transformed how stories like the Bellamys are preserved and shared. Archives once dusty in courthouse basements were digitized and made accessible online. Old photographs, documents, sheriff's reports, and newspaper articles became available with a few clicks. In 2015, 120 years after the disappearance, a college student created a comprehensive website dedicated exclusively to the Bellamy case, compiling all known information with interactive maps, detailed timelines, and digital reconstructions of the cabin. True crime podcasts surged in popularity over the next decade, with several dedicating episodes to the Bellamy mystery. Some were well-researched and respectful. Others were more sensational, adding dramatic elements or conspiracy theories without evidence. Regardless of quality, these podcasts introduced the story to millions worldwide who had never heard of the Ozarks or Webster County, but were fascinated by this century-old enigma. One podcast released in 2018 proposed a theory that sparked considerable discussion. The host, after extensive research, suggested the mysterious man in Sarah Bellamy's notebook might have been an unidentified serial criminal operating in the rural central United States during that era. The host compiled records of other similar disappearances in Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas in the 1890s, suggesting a possible pattern. While intriguing, more cautious historians noted the extreme difficulty of establishing definitive connections between such old and sparsely documented cases. In 2020, exactly 125 years after the disappearance, interest in the Bellamy case experienced a remarkable resurgence. The dedicated website saw a significant traffic increase. Online forum discussions grew more active. Some individuals devoted considerable time to reviewing every detail, searching for connections missed over more than a century of investigation. It was during this period that a surprising discovery was made, not in the Missouri mountains, but in a house in eastern Kansas. An elderly woman named Ruth Hamilton was organizing her late mother's attic when she found an old box containing letters, photographs, and family documents. Among them was a diary belonging to her great-grandfather, James Crawford. Ruth initially didn't make the connection, but as she read, she realized James Crawford was a distant cousin of Robert Crawford, the neighbor who discovered the abandoned cabin. The diary, written between 1893 and 1898, contained entries mentioning the case. In a December 1895 entry, 2 months after the disappearance, James wrote about a conversation with Robert during a visit. According to the diary, Robert was deeply disturbed not only by the disappearance, but by something he had seen or heard, something he could not fully articulate, something that made him question what he truly knew about the people living in the surrounding mountains. The entry was vague, lacking specific details, but it suggested Robert Crawford may have harbored suspicions about someone in the area. Suspicions never formally recorded because he lacked evidence. Ruth Hamilton, struck by her discovery, contacted the Missouri Historical Society and donated her great-grandfather's diary to their archives. Historians confirmed its authenticity. The diary was added to the growing collection of materials related to the Bellamy case, another piece of a puzzle seemingly destined to remain incomplete. The discovery served as a reminder that even after 125 years, undiscovered documents, untold stories, and fragments of truth still lay scattered, waiting to be found. Today, more than 130 years after that October night in 1895, the Bellamy family mystery remains unsolved. We do not know with absolute certainty what happened to Thomas, Margaret, Joshua, Sarah, Emma, and little Daniel. The bones found in the ravine may have been theirs, or they may have belonged to other souls, lost in the dangerous Ozark wilderness. The mysterious man watching from the woods was never identified. The voices Samuel Hartwell heard that long ago night were never explained. The blue cloth caught in the bush remains only a possibility, not a certainty. Yet perhaps the most important lesson from this story lies not in the answers we lack, but in the questions it compels us to ask about how fragile life can be, especially in times and places where the protection of law and community was tenuous, about how elusive truth can be, hidden not by elaborate conspiracy, but simply by the limitations of time, distance, and human capacity to document and remember, about how each generation returns to these ancient stories, searching for something that resonates with its own experiences and fears. The Ozark Mountains remain, more accessible now than ever, yet still holding their secrets in deep ravines, dark caves, and dense forests where sunlight struggles to penetrate. The wind still sighs through the pines and oaks, perhaps carrying echoes of events we will never fully understand. And in a quiet Webster County cemetery, a weathered headstone marks the place where 5 people, or perhaps just 3, found final rest decades after their disappearance. Their names are nearly erased by time, but not entirely forgotten. The Bellamy family story reminds us that not all mysteries are solved, that not all questions have answers, and that sometimes all we can do is honor the memory of those lost, acknowledge their humanity and their dashed hopes, and carry their stories forward so they do not vanish completely into the mists of time. They lived, loved, dreamed, and suffered. While we may never know exactly how their lives ended, we know they mattered, and that their story continues to touch us more than a century later.